The African Child, Chapter 5. At Kurosa, I lived in my mother's hut. My brothers, who were younger, and my sisters, the eldest of whom came 12 months after me, all used to sleep in my father's mother's hut. I did not have the hut's second bed to myself. This was because the huts were so small, but I shared this bed with my father's youngest apprentices. My father always had a lot of apprentices in his workshop. They came from far and near, often from very remote districts, mainly, I think, because he treated them so well, but above all, because his skill as a craftsman was widely acknowledged, and also, I imagine, because there was always plenty of work at the forge. But these apprentices had to have somewhere to sleep. Those who had reached manhood had their own hut. The youngest, those who, like me, were still uncircumcised, slept in my mother's hut. My father certainly thought they could have no better lodging. My mother was very kind, very correct. She also had great authority and kept an eye on everything we did, so that her kindness was not altogether untempered by severity. But how could it have been otherwise when there were at that time, apart from the apprentices, a dozen or so children running about the compound, children who were not good all the time, but always so full of life that they must often have sorely tried their mother's patience. And my mother was not a very patient woman. I see now that she was more patient with the apprentices than she was with her own children. She put herself out for them more than she did for us. The apprentices were far from home, and both my mother and my father were very affectionate with them, cuddling them like babies and indulging them more than they did their own children. I was certainly my mother's chief concern, though she did not show it. The apprentices were encouraged to think of themselves as on an equal footing with the master's children. I thought of them all as elder brothers. I remember one of them in particular, Sidafa. He was a little older than myself, very lively, thin but vigorous, hot-blooded, always full of projects and ideas of every kind. As my days were spent at school and his in the workshop, the only time we had for chattering was when we went to bed. The air in the hut was warm, and the oil lamps at the side of the bed cast a dim light. I would repeat to Sidafa what I had been learning in school that day, and he, for his part, would recount in detail all that had gone on in the workshop. My mother, whose bed was separated from ours only by the width of the hearth, had of necessity to listen to our chatter. At least she would listen for a while. She would soon get weary of it. Have you two gone to bed to chatter or to sleep? She would say. Now go to sleep, both of you. Just a little longer, please. I haven't finished my story, I would plead. Or I would get up and take a drink of water to the canary who, perched over his little bed of gravel, had lost his voice. But the respite I asked for was not always granted, though when it was, we used to abuse the privilege so that my mother would sooner or later interrupt us sharply. Now that's enough of that, she would say. I don't want to hear another word. You'll neither of you be able to get up in the morning. Which was true. If we were never in any great hurry to go to sleep, neither were we ever in any great hurry to get up. So we would stop our chattering. The beds were not far enough removed from my mother's sharp ears for us to be able to converse in whispers. But as soon as we were quiet, we very quickly used to feel our eyes grow heavy. The cozy crackling of the fire and the warmth of the bedclothes did the rest. We would gradually drift off into sleep. In the morning, when after some persuasion we rose, we would find the breakfast all ready. My mother used to get up at dawn to prepare it. We all would squat round the great steaming platters. My parents, sisters, brothers, and their apprentices, those who shared my bed, as well as those who had their own hut. There would be one dish for the men, and another for my mother and my sisters. It would not be exactly right for me to say that my mother presided over the meal. My father was the one who did that. Nevertheless, it was my mother's presence that made itself felt first of all. Was that because she had prepared the food? Because meals are mainly a woman's business. Maybe. But there was something else. My mother, by the mere fact of her presence, and even though she was not seated immediately in front of the men's dish, saw to it that everything was done according to her own set of rules. And those rules were strict. For example, it was forbidden to cast my gaze upon guests older than myself, and I was also forbidden to talk. My whole attention had to be fixed on the food in front of me. In fact, it would have been considered most impolite to chatter at that moment. Even my younger brothers knew that this was no time to jabber. This was the moment to honor our food. Older people observed more or less the same silence. This was not the only rule. Those concerning cleanliness were no more less important. Finally, if there was meat on the dish, I was not allowed to help myself from the center. but only from the part directly in front of me. My father would put more within my reach if he saw that I needed it. Any other behavior would have been frowned upon and quickly reprimanded. In any case, my own portion was always so generous that I should never have been tempted to take more than I was given. When the meal was over, I would say, "Thank you, Father." The apprentices would all say, "Thank you, Master." Then I would bow to my mother and say, "The meal was good, Mother." My brothers, my sisters, and the apprentices would do likewise. Then my parents would reply, "Thank you," to each one of them. Such was the rule. My father would certainly have been offended to see it broken. But it was my mother, with her quicker temper, who rebuked any transgression. My father's mind was already on his work, and he left those prerogatives to her. I realized that my mother's authoritarian attitudes may appear surprising. Generally, the role of the African woman is thought to be a ridiculously humble one. And indeed, there are parts of the continent where it is insignificant. But Africa is vast, with a correspondingly vast diversity of types. In our country, the woman's rule is one of fundamental independence. She has great personal pride. We despise only those who allow themselves to be despised. And our women very seldom give cause for that. My father would never have dreamed of despising anyone, least of all my mother. He had the greatest respect for her, and so did our friends and neighbors. That was due, I'm sure, to my mother's character, which was impressive. It was due also to the strange powers she possessed. I hesitate to say what these powers were, and I do not wish to describe them all. I know that what I have to tell you will perhaps be greeted with skeptical smiles. And today, now that I come to think about them, even I hardly know what to make of them. They seem to me incredible. They are incredible. Nevertheless, I can only tell you what I saw with my own eyes. How could I disown the testimony of my own eyes? I saw those incredible things. I seem to see them again as I saw them then. Are there not things everywhere around us that are incapable of explanation? In our country, there were mysteries without number, and my mother was familiar with all of them. One day, it was towards evening, I saw some men come and request her to use her powers to get a horse on his feet after he had resisted all attempts to make him rise. He was out at pasture, but he was lying down and his owner wanted to bring him back to the stable before nightfall. The horse obstinately refused to move, although there was no apparent reason. why he should disobey. But his inclination was otherwise, and it may have been some magic spell that was keeping him from moving. I heard the men telling my mother about it and asking for help. "Let's go and have a look at this horse then," said my mother. She called the eldest of my sisters and told her to look after the cooking of the evening meal, and then went off with the men. I followed after her. When we arrived at the pasture, we saw the horse. He was lying on the grass, gazing at us unconcernedly. His owner tried again to make him get up and spoke to him in honeyed tones, but the horse remained deaf to all entreaty. His master raised a hand to strike him. "Do not strike him," said my mother. "It won't do any good." She went up to the horse and, lifting her hand, disclaimed in a solemn tone of voice, "If it be true that from the day of my birth I had knowledge of no man until the day of my marriage, and if it be true that from the day of my marriage I have had knowledge of no man other than my lawful husband, if these things be true, then I command you, horse, rise up." And we all saw the horse get up at once and follow his master quietly away. I have told in very simple language, but very precisely, what I saw that day, saw with my own eyes. And to my mind, the thing is incredible. But the event was just as I have described it. The horse got up without any further delay and followed his master. If he had refused to follow him, my mother would have intervened once more until she had achieved the desired effect. Where did these powers come from? Well, my mother was born immediately after my twin uncles in Tindikan. Now they say that twin brothers are wiser than other children and are practically magicians. For the child that followed them and who receives the name Sion, that is, the younger brother of twins, he too is endowed with the gift of magic, and he is even considered to be more powerful than the twins, in whose lives he plays a very important role because his birth is even more mysterious than theirs. So if it happens that twins fall out, it is to the Sion's authority that they appeal to settle the matter. Indeed, he is accredited with a wisdom greater than that of the twins and is given more consideration. It goes without saying that his interventions are always conducted, must be conducted, and in most tactful way. It is a custom with us for twins to agree about everything, and they have by right a more precise equality of treatment than is accorded to other children. If something is given to one, the other must be given the same thing also. It is an obligation which must never be disregarded. If it is, the twins are both equally hurt. Settle the matter between themselves, and in certain cases, cast a spell upon the person who has injured them. If any kind of dispute should arise between them, if one, for example, has a plan which the other thinks is foolish, they make an appeal to their younger brother and are happy to accept his decision. I have given one example of my mother's supernatural powers. I could give many others, equally strange, equally mysterious. How many times have I not seen my mother at daybreak walking a few steps into the yard and turning her head in one direction or another to shout at the top of her voice, "If this business goes any further, I shall not hesitate to expose you. That's my final word." Her voice in the early morning traveled far. It was intended to reach the ears of the witch doctor, for whom the warning had been uttered. He understood that if he did not stop his nocturnal activities, my mother would denounce him in public. And this threat always worked. From then on, the witch doctor would remain quiet. My mother used to receive warning of these activities while she was asleep. That is why we never wakened her, for fear of interrupting the course of the revelations that flowed through her dreams. This power was well known by our neighbors and by the whole community. No one ever doubted it. As well as this gift, or rather, part gift of magic, my mother had other powers that she had inherited in the same way. Her father, Atindikan, had been a skillful blacksmith, and my mother possessed the usual powers of that caste, from which the majority of circumcisers and many soothsayers are drawn. My mother's brothers had chosen to be farmers, but if they had not followed their father's trade, that was their own affair. Perhaps my uncle Lasana, the silent one, who was a great dreamer, in fixing his choice upon a farm worker's life, upon the immense peace of the fields, had led his brothers away from the paternal forge. Was he also a soothsayer? I am inclined to think he was. He had the customary powers of a twin and the powers of his caste. Only I do not think he showed them very often. It was in my mother that the spirit of her caste was most visibly, I was going to say ostensibly, manifested. Finally, she had naturally inherited from my grandfather's his totem, which is the crocodile. This totem allowed all Damans to draw water from the Niger with impunity. Normally, everyone draws their water from the river. The Niger flows slowly and abundantly. It can't be forded, and the crocodiles that keep to the deep water upstream or downstream from where the water is drawn are not to be feared. You can bathe quite freely on the banks of pale sand and do your washing there. But at the time of the rising of the waters, the volume of the river is increased threefold. Everywhere there is deep water, and the crocodiles are dangerous. You can see their triangular heads breaking the surface of the water. So everyone keeps away from the river and draws his water from the little streams. But my mother used to continue to draw water from the river. I would watch her draw water from the parts where there were crocodiles. Naturally, I used to watch her from a distance, for my totem is not my mother's. And I had every reason to fear those voracious beasts. But my mother could draw water without fear, and no one warned her of the danger, because everyone knew that the danger did not exist for her. Whoever had ventured to do what my mother used to do would inevitably have been knocked down by a blow from a powerful tail, seized in the terrible jaws, and dragged into deep water. But the crocodiles could do no harm to my mother. And this privilege is quite understandable. The totem is identified with its possessor. This identification is absolute and of such a nature that its possessor has the power to take on the form of the totem itself. It follows quite obviously that the totem cannot devour itself. My uncles at Tindikan enjoyed the same prerogative. I do not wish to say more, and I have told you only what I saw with my own eyes. These miracles, they were miracles indeed. Nowadays, I think about them as if they were the fabulous events of a far-off past. That past is, however, still quite near. It was only yesterday. But the world rolls on. The world changes. My own world, perhaps, more rapidly than anyone's, so that it appears as if we are ceasing to be what we were, and that truly we are no longer what we were, and that we were not exactly ourselves, even at the time when these miracles took place before our eyes. Yes, the world rolls on and changes. I, too, had my totem, but I no longer remember what it was. The